I just wanted to give a brief update about the air conditioning in the building, because we've had some questions, because I know there's a bit of a trade-off between doors being open and air conditioning being on. So I've talked to the property management, and this is a LEED certified building, so when you have the doors open, the air conditioning automatically goes off. So the solution they've come up with is that during the morning, when it's still cool outside, we'll have all the doors open, it'll breeze back and forth, and then the doors will be closed in the afternoon. Rest assured, there are filters through all of it, and the air conditioning will be on. If you are uncomfortable with this plan, I welcome you to go to the Google Cloud Pavilion, which is just outside there, and we have all the things being live streamed where you can have refreshments and be in the fresh air and enjoy all the programming. So I hope this makes people feel comfortable. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Daphne Lindsay, who's a great friend to our program. She's the executive editor of Politico, and we will have a fabulous discussion on NATO. Thanks so much, Daphne.
Great, thank you so much, Niamh. And hello to everyone. I'm Daphne Lindsay. I'm the executive editor of Politico. It's an honor to be here this morning with such a distinguished group representing the most important perspectives right now on the NATO alliance and where it's headed at a moment of great challenge and great importance. We're so very fortunate to be with incredible public servants who can help us understand this best, and it's a privilege to introduce them to you now. And I'm going to start with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland, Marcin Fizdacz. And I should say this is the first year that Poland has sent a delegation to the Security Forum, and it's a reminder of the critical role the forum plays and a measure of the significance of Poland's role in the alliance at this moment. Kay Bailey Hutchison, thank you. Indeed. Kay Bailey Hutchison was U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2017 to 2021 and served for 2 decades as the U.S. Senator from Texas. Ivo Daalder is president at the end there on global affairs and served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013, and as we like to say at Politico, also a columnist. And I should note somebody who's has served as ambassador right after Ambassador Daalder and right before Ambassador Hutchison is also in the audience today, General Doug Lute, who will speak later this morning on Afghanistan. And of course, Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania serves on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee and is a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So brings us 2 very important perspectives right now in the U.S. We have a lot to cover, much is at stake. I'm going to try to leave questions, time for questions, but let's get started. And let's get started, please, with you, Mr. Minister. Poland's made clear that Russia's war in Ukraine is an existential one for Poland and the West, and as a frontline state, you have everything on the line. If you were the leader of NATO, what would you do right now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here as a representative of the Polish government with such distinguished panelists in front of the fantastic audience. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, the war in Ukraine, the Russian incursion to Ukraine is a threat not only to Poland but to the entire Euro-Atlantic community. The clear violation of international law, but also the attempt to recreate the empire, the post-Soviet or post-Tsarist empire is the existential threat to the global security, not only because of the fact that Russia as an aggressive actor is trying to recreate the global security architecture, but is also a first attempt to change the rules. To change the rules first by Russia, but I'm pretty sure that other big superpower just next to Russia is clearly observing what is going on in Eastern Europe, in the eastern part of our continent, and taking lessons from our reaction and from possible success of this Putin's operation. So it is an existential threat to the world we are living in right now. We as Poland, 30 years ago, we've just managed to come back to the democratic world, throwing back somehow, or throwing away the Russian dominance over our country, and we are absolutely not interested to go back to this sphere of influence, and I can speak on behalf of many other Central European countries. So what we could do now as NATO or as the Western coalition is to continue what we are doing right now, but in more active and efficient way, I would say. So first, the continuation on policy of sanctions, despite the fact that there are some costs on our side as well, but we need to choose whether we want to take the way of appeasement, as it was in the 30s, and we know what was the result of this policy, or rather to be a bit more active in pushing back Russia and sanctioning it. The second, of course, supporting Ukraine, offering our assistance. We've done a bit. One may say that we've done a lot, but there is always a room for improvement. There is always room for doing much more. It's good that we finally, as the Western coalition, decided to provide them with the most sophisticated or technologically advanced equipment. That is what they really need. They are fighting not only for their own sovereignty and independence, for the values which are probably shared by all of us, but they are also fighting for the entire security of our community, doing great job. That's why they deserve our support. And the third, you've asked me what would I do as a NATO leader. Although NATO is a defensive alliance, so there is rather job to be done bilaterally and by the coalition of the like-minded countries. But NATO has also an important role to play as a coordination platform for those efforts, but also through a more visible and active presence on the front line. The Madrid summit says that Russia is a direct threat to our alliance, so more equipment, more troops on the eastern flank as with a defensive posture, but as a strategic message towards Moscow, don't even try. Just like President Joe Biden said a couple of weeks ago, we are ready to defend. We are not interested in any kind of interaction with Russia, but this is the strategic message to Moscow. Don't even think about any aggressive steps towards NATO.
Thank you for that. We just heard from Richard Moore talk about how maybe Russia is tiring more than we thought, because here we're talking a lot about fatigue in the West, a limited attention span, war fatigue. That seems to be what Putin is betting on. Ambassador Hutchison, how does NATO ensure that Putin loses that bet?
Well, I think NATO is, as everyone knows, and as Richard said earlier, it is stronger than ever. We're getting ready to add 2 new members, and not just new members, significant members that have been with us in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in our missions. So NATO is strong, and I think what the ambassador said, and I want to say right away, Poland has been a wonderful ally in NATO. Tomas, your ambassador, was a good friend and stalwart and committed. But what we're looking at now, and what Richard said, is Russia is tiring. I think Russia has seen this unity of NATO and our partners. NATO is 30, almost 32 members, but we have 40 partners that are helping in Ukraine, coming together in the like-minded, which I think is also something that President Xi is watching, that we are coming together. We are, of course, have all of our different country interests, but we are not flagging an interest and commitment to standing up for Ukraine, because this is a signal to Russia that we're not going to back down, that you can't use leverage on us. And I think one of the most important things we're doing is trying to produce more energy so America will be self-sufficient, and we need to work on that in this administration. But we want to be able to export our natural gas to our European allies so that they can walk away from Russia with ease. So we're doing a lot. I think the unity of NATO and our partners and what happened in the summit where Asia-Pacific heads of state were invited. We are a convener at NATO of like-minded. And in our 40 partners, we have like-minded in the Middle East as well as Europe. South America, we're starting there. Africa, starting. And that is to say, if you believe in the values of human rights and our way of life, then we need to be unified, because that's our best leverage, not only now, but for sure against a potential adversary in China.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about expansion, what happened in Madrid and what it means. Ambassador Daalder, you know, when we talk about this and listen to Ambassador Hutchison talk about how strong the alliance is, 2.5 years ago, Emmanuel Macron said NATO was brain dead. And it seemed like President Trump might withdraw from the alliance altogether. And today it may be the most powerful global alliance in history. What did they miss about NATO 2 years ago?
Well, first of all, it's great to be on a panel where the title is not Whither NATO or NATO in Crisis. I've been on a lot of those. It's been going on for about a good 60 years, I think, that people have been questioning NATO, and they've always been wrong. For at the core of it, a very simple reason. These are right now 30, soon to be 32, hopefully even more down the road, countries who share, one, a common set of values about what it is that is important for them. Yes, there are differences among the NATO states, and not everyone lives up to the exact same values that we all would like to live up to. But in general, there is a sense that we are together because we are like-minded, as Ambassador Hutchison said, like-minded countries. But secondly, a fundamental belief that the security of each and every one of these countries is fundamental to their own security. And the lesson that the United States learned from World War I and World War II was that a permanent presence in Europe was important for the security of the United States. NATO became the means to that end. And everyone in NATO, old members and new, understand that being together in an alliance is the best way to find their own security. Finland and Sweden have just decided that after 200 years of armed neutrality in the case of Finland, 100 years of independence, in the case of Sweden, 100 years of independence of Finland, that they can only be secure by being part of NATO. So that's what people miss. People miss that the fundamental reason NATO exists and persists is that at the core, it is the institution that for the members provides fundamental security. And it was reaffirmed in spades in the current crisis. It's not an accident that this war happened after NATO, including the United States, said that it was not going to defend Ukraine because it was not a member. That war has not gone further because the United States and NATO have said that they will defend every inch of NATO territory. So that's the lesson. The lesson is fundamental, that if you want to be secure, being part of this alliance is fundamental. And brain dead or obsolete, crisis or withering, we'll go through that over and over again. But when you are in Brussels or when you're in capitals, you understand that fundamentally, when it comes down to the core of it, you want to be secure, being a member of NATO is critical.
Thank you for that. Congressman Boyle, let's turn to the view from Congress. I feel like Ambassador Daalder just talked a lot about unity in the alliance, and there was some unity in Congress for the first time in a long time. I'm thinking about when President Biden spoke at the State of the Union, got a standing ovation, sustained from members of both parties when he talked about Ukraine and support for NATO. But that support is not a given, is it? I want to just, before you take us down there, I want to just give people a sense of what's happening with members and their constituents. One of your colleagues, Congressman Abigail Spanberger, had a virtual town hall the other day and got a sustained questioning from a constituent who feels that when it comes to NATO and Ukraine, this is what he said to Representative Spanberger, we're just throwing money out the window. That's for a Democrat in a swing district. Should we be worried that the tide's turning in Congress about support for Ukraine and NATO?
Well, first, you could literally physically see the manifestation of that union during the State of the Union about 5 months ago, which coincided about 2 weeks after the invasion. The first 8 to 10 minutes of President Biden's speech, you saw members on both sides of the aisle standing up, constantly applauding. That was the only time during the speech you would see that happen. Now we're 5 months later, and the shock has worn off. I would say that in terms of U.S. domestic public opinion and Congress, we fortunately have not turned a corner in people turning their back on Ukraine. But at the same time, I would very much caution anyone who assumes that this unity will last forever and that the support of the American people will last forever. I can't tell you how many constituents of mine, and I come from a fairly Democratic district in Philadelphia, you'll see memes from people who are fairly apolitical in my district showing the price of gas or showing empty shelves and then say, oh great, but Congress has sent another X number of $1 billion to Ukraine. Now, in terms, shifting from public opinion to where Congress is at the moment, you saw, I mean, and these numbers are from the recent votes we've had, almost every Democratic member of Congress approving the latest emergency appropriation for Ukraine, and about 2/3 of Republican members. And I think that will continue to last, at least in the short term. What concerns me, though, is that other third of the Republican conference, which is closer to the more Trumpist activist base. And by the way, that's not even including a couple prominent Republican candidates right now in Arizona and Ohio and elsewhere, that are pushing almost the pre-Cold War Taft isolationist view with a sort of populist tinge associated with it. It concerns me that as long as we have this inflation crisis in the West, including the United States, that movement will grow. Let's face it, it is very easy to say, back home it is very easy to demagogue foreign aid, always has been, always will be. Likewise, the longer this war goes on, it will be easier for people running for office to demagogue the amount of money we're spending in Ukraine and saying, well, what about us? What about the American people? Congressman Boyle doesn't care about our constituents. Unfortunately, that is a very easy argument to make. So it's all the more important that people in positions like this make the case, yes, why it is in American interests, what we're doing.
Mr. Minister, can you comment on that just a little bit? Because what is happening here is happening in other Western European countries facing elections where this is an issue. And I imagine for Poland and also other members of NATO, including the U.S., this is something you have to grapple with in terms of kind of holding folks together and making sure that you've got the funding and the support. What can Poland do to kind of help buttress that message?
Well, definitely, I mean, a couple of months after the invasion, there are already some symptoms of the war fatigue or Ukraine's fatigue, and it's quite, I would say, natural. There are some costs on our side with regards to this war. But I think we should stick to the values which are very important for us and to our interests. The father of our independence, Marszał Piłsudski, once said that people think that the independence would cost them only a drop of blood, just a bit, right? And I would say that this is the quotation which could work also today. I mean, people may think that to keep the stability and peace in the world would cost them only a penny or just a cent, just without any expenses. So there is a lot to do. I mean, in order to encourage people to our societies to support this policy. I can imagine that also on the American scene down here, there is already discussion about your engagement. There are some voices about the isolation, as Congressman said. I would say that the United States has a special role to play on the global scene, with a specific job to be done as the leader of the free world. Then there is a lot of expectation towards Washington, just as a leader. We are there is a division of labor. We are doing our job, but we need a leader, and this leadership was proven since November, since the visit of the director of your intelligence in Europe. Throughout the next months, we've managed to build the unity. What we need to do is just to keep this unity and fight the disinformation. There's a lot of disinformation spread by authoritarian regimes globally, blaming us as the Western community for what is happening: food crisis, energy prices, inflation, etc. We need to take an active role in fighting this, because I mean, it's not enough to believe in truth. The truth needs to be somehow defended, and that's our job to be done.
Thank you for that. And I think, Ambassador Hutchison, you started off talking about the expansion of NATO and what happened in Madrid. You know, a North Atlantic treaty organization opened the doors to the Indo-Pacific, which was a pretty big move. So I think some are seeing it as a move aimed at China, but is it really a message more to Moscow to have to kind of defend territory now on 3 borders, from the Baltics to the Black Sea?
Since America made the strategic concept, and really starting in 2018, China became the focus. With Russia always right now, China was just a little bit out. And from that point, looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, the predatory lending of the Chinese, where they would take infrastructure when a country couldn't repay loans, when China started coming into the Arctic and having an Arctic Belt and Road Initiative and trying to get base operations in Greenland and Iceland, then it became very clear. And when Huawei was making such a push, it became very clear that we had to start an increase in NATO coverage as a convener of like-minded. And we have to always say it's not just democracies, it is the like-minded, because we have Middle Eastern countries that are very strong partners, that want to be with us, that want us to stand. And as you said, and as the minister said, America must be the leader. We must be the leader of NATO and the convener of the partners that would form a unity, because it is the unity that is going to be the deterrence to Russia as well as China. So when you say, was all of this for China? Yes, of course it was, that we see a risk. And this is America's unique role in the world. We are the only country that will assess a risk, a long-term risk, and will begin to deter against that risk. That's what we do. There's not a European country, there's not another country in the world other than China that does that. That's why we are the essential, and as I love Madeleine Albright, she always said, we are the essential leader. And we are going to be that leader to show the commitment and the strength. And part of that was to begin to reach out to our partners in Asia who were so strong, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, to say, come in, meet with us. That's going to be the beginning of military. Now, they're all already militarily cooperating, but interoperability, really knowing how we operate. Our 40 partners in Afghanistan have operated with us, and we had partners from across the globe that now are familiar with our ethics, our tactics, our capabilities, and this is part of our deterrence effort and why NATO, led by the US, is going to be the convener that will be the message right now to Russia. But for sure, as Richard said earlier, she is taking notes and watching and seeing if we will keep that commitment and if we will stay strong. If we are strong and united and committed to seeing it through with Ukraine, that message is going to reap huge profits back to us in the safety and security of unity and deterrence.
Ambassador Daalder, let me ask you, is there a limit to the number of countries that could be NATO members? Is there a limit to the size of the membership? Is there a region that's off limits for this alliance?
Yeah, under the treaty, it has to be a European state, so you're limited to the number of European states, which, by the way, includes Russia. And there was a time, not that long ago, in which Russia had an interest, including Vladimir Putin, potentially joining NATO.
We reached out to them.
Yeah,
as
we
you
did.
know.
We spent a lot of time working with them, and then they proved who they really were. But it is not just membership, although membership is important. It's the partnerships that Kate talked about that are fundamental. We haven't actually had military operations as a NATO country without non-NATO members being part of that. That's true in Kosovo. It was true in the operation to deal with counter-piracy in the Sea of Aden. By the way, the Chinese were part of that operation under NATO organization and command. And of course, it was the case in Afghanistan, but it was the case in Libya too. Indeed, in order for NATO to get an agreement to intervene in Libya, we had to secure the partnership of a number of Arab countries as part of that operation. Sweden participated in that operation, even though half of NATO countries did not. So NATO is not just about the members, although it is first and foremost about the members. It is also a mechanism to enable military operations and political dialogue that, frankly, is unique. It's unique in history. It is certainly unique today. There's no other organization that has that power of attraction in the security field. Yes, in other areas, but in the security field. And it's one of the great advantages we, the United States, have. We have allies. China and Russia have clients. There's a fundamental difference between those two. It means that we are able to achieve what we need to achieve, not just for ourselves, but together with others, and compete effectively with countries like China and Russia. And that's why actually spending time thinking about how do you bring these partners, how do you bring these allies, and how do you maintain that unity is so important. And I think we now talk about NATO being stronger and more united than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War. It takes hard work to do that. You know, I applaud everyone in the administration and otherwise, and including on the Hill, demonstrating the capacity to say that we stand with you and we are willing to work with you for that end. That's what makes this country great. It's when it really works in that way, in partnership, and NATO is the means to that end.
Let me ask you both, when you and Ambassador Hutchison were based in Brussels, a lot of the work at NATO at that moment was focused on Afghanistan. But turning now to this moment and what NATO needs to do and what it's being asked to do you feel like there are changes, we need to modernize in terms of ability to defend? I mean, what needs to change? What are the lessons that we've learned right now about NATO's capabilities?
So there's some fundamental decisions that were made in Madrid that I think are extremely important. First and foremost, as soon as Finland becomes a member of NATO, which we hope will happen as soon as possible, the front line between NATO and Russia will stretch not just from the Baltics to the Black Sea, it will stretch from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. We are adding 1,800 kilometers of territory to be defended as part of the NATO operation. It also means that the Russian forces have to be stretched across that whole line, which makes it, in some ways, more difficult for them to think about offensive operations. So that's number one. Bringing Finland and Sweden in with real capabilities is a fundamental change also in the situation of how to defend Poland, how to defend the Baltic states. Secondly, NATO already made the decision before Madrid and is now formalized to put in rotating forces, not just in the Baltic Seas and in Poland, but also in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, and to beef those up from battalion size to brigade size. That's a significant push-up in terms of the kind of capabilities that are being deployed. Third, the NATO Rapid Reaction Force, which now is in operation, 40,000 troops under NATO command, is going to be expanded to be 300,000 troops with 100,000 deployable within 10 days and further 200,000 deployable in 30 days. And then finally, the United States has made some fundamental commitments to defense of Europe. Unfortunately, I was the ambassador who had to tell our friends in Eastern Europe that we were reducing our capabilities in Europe. Now, I'm glad that Ambassador Smith has the job of telling them we're going to increase our capabilities in Europe, and we are increasing them. We're sending one more combat brigade to be deployed in Romania. We're going to have a combat headquarter staff in Poland. We're sending
Permanent
two more.
this time.
Sorry?
Permanent.
Permanent. Permanent, yes.
Rotation.
Not
That's
rotation.
very important.
Yes, I know the word permanent has a particular ring to it when one is in Poland. We're going to send 2 more squadrons of F-35s to the UK. We're increasing our naval presence in Spain by 50%, and we're upping the number of troops to now 100,000 American troops back in Europe. This is a very significant military capability, and it has one purpose. The purpose is to remind everyone in Europe that if Russia does anything, we will be there to defend them.
Minister, what do you think when you hear that? Do you feel that NATO's in the right position and has what it needs?
Well, as it was already mentioned, there were ups and downs in the strategy of NATO. We are happy that this time NATO reacted properly to the direct threats on those type of NATO. We welcome very much the decision of Madrid summit, but we perceive it, Excellency Ambassador, as a first step of a very good history ahead of us. So the permanent presence of the 5th Corps is very much welcome, but what we need on the eastern flank is more combat-ready units, which, as I said before, would be a strategic message to Moscow that we are ready to defend, just like President Biden said, every inch of our territory from the very beginning. Not liberating the territory. After Bucha and Irpin, what happened next to Kiev, we know what does it mean to be occupied by Russia, and any kind of liberation may bring some losses before this liberation. So it is should be in the NATO strategy to defend itself from the very, very first day. But to do that, we need to increase the number of troops, and as I said, we welcome very much those decisions about Romania, the decision to increase from battalion groups to brigades. There is a framework already, but it's up to the framework country, which in case of Poland is the US, and the US administration should decide about it. We'll be encouraging our partners to be even more present on Polish soil. But we are doing also our job. We are spending 2% of GDP already for several years, but we expanded to 3% of our GDP since 2023. Already decided to acquire, to purchase a lot of equipment, mostly in the USA. I mean, your products, starting from Abrams tanks through HIMARS and the air defense system, and all that kind of sophisticated equipment, doing our job properly. I think so. We are ready to commit. We are ready to be an ally, just as Ambassador said. I'm pretty sure that many other Eastern allies are ready to do the same under the leadership. But let's hope that it's just the worst case scenario. We need to, let me call it in Latin, pacem parabellum. If you want to have peace, you need to be ready for fight, and that's the Polish approach. We are absolutely peaceful country, but we need to be ready to defend ourselves.
Congressman Boyle, you heard that combat-ready troops, 3% GDP. From an oversight perspective, does that sound like something that Congress would support?
So first, in terms of the Wales commitment, the 2%, obviously this is something, it actually started with President Obama. President Trump obviously made a very big deal about it. I am glad that finally we are seeing those who weren't living up to the 2% commitment finally get there, most importantly, Germany. Now, I would just, again, caution, the headline is that countries are recommitting and moving finally toward the 2%. There is actually no agreed upon definition among NATO partners what counts toward that 2%. So in the US, we're at almost 4, between 3.5% and 4%. A number of countries are over 2, but you know, things like pensions and certain things like that, some countries count, others do not. In terms of capabilities, though, moving forward, I remember when I was part of, I mean, this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, part of the US delegation to the NATO Parliament and met with then Ambassador Hutchison. We were talking about two things that are still relevant today. One was cybersecurity, which, at least in Congress and on Capitol Hill, I am concerned conversation about that has sort of receded over the last 5 months. But if we go back to late February with the shock of the invasion of especially of Kyiv, for years, indeed a decade, the primary way Putin destabilized countries, not just in Eastern Europe, but in the West as well, was in the cyber sphere. And that is an area where we talked about it years ago, but we still have more work to do. And then very basic things as well, such as troop movements from west to east, and systems that are not quite totally operable and can communicate with one another. We had that conversation again just in February when we were over visiting our current ambassador, Julie Smith. Final point I would just say on this, I do think that it is important for us to remember just what a shock 5 months ago was. Just by happenstance, our NATO Parliament annual session was taking place in Brussels the week of the invasion. When we got there Sunday night, 24 hours before Putin gave that long, rambling speech on TV about Ukraine, and about 72 hours before the actual invasion, at the opening dinner that Sunday evening, the vast majority of my parliamentary colleagues, many of whom I've become friends with over the last 4 or 5 years, bright people who believe in NATO, the vast majority did not believe the US intelligence and did not believe that Putin would invade Ukraine. So particularly for our European friends, this is still just a culture shock and permeates through society.
Minister, does that speak to the disinformation you were talking about earlier? Do you think that is why it was such a surprise for so many?
Partly, yes. Probably it was also an effect of disinformation, but I think it was shock for many because many of our friends, allies, were really not prepared for such a change, that there will be real war in the very center of the continent. I mean, it's the part of the continent, but in Europe in the 21st century. There were some, blockades. They couldn't really imagine that could happen. And having in mind already some also decisions before the war, with regards to the, for example, energy resources and this collaboration of some of our allies and partners from Western Europe, namely Nord Stream 2, probably for them it was even more difficult to imagine that Mr. Putin wouldn't be a great business partner as they wanted to see him, to see him, but just an aggressor. There is a, that feeling in Central European countries that we were a bit Cassandric about this. We were really telling our allies, look what happened in Georgia in 2008, look what happened with Crimea and Donbas already in 2014, 15, and later. Nobody really wanted to believe us, but when I realized that those partners, they don't even believe the US intelligence, I said, probably there is something more than just, thinking about Putin as a stable business partner. But that's the past. Now what we need to do is to keep the unity and to work together in order to deter Russia, to make it understand that we will not step back, because Moscow, and especially the ruling circles, the KGB officers, what they really understand is the language of power. I mean, once we really show them that we are strong enough, that we are the strongest alliance in the world, I believe they may step back. Once we will start sending signals of possible dialogue and that kind of diplomacy, which is quite natural for many of us diplomats, politicians, but not this time. This time, it will be perceived by Mr. Putin as a sign of weakness, that we are weak enough and asking him for dialogue. Not at this very moment. What we need to do, as I said, to continue our policy supporting Ukraine in terms of equipment, but also financially. Let me add that this country is really destroyed by this war. Millions of people had to flee this country, so the economy is not working properly. They really count on our financial assistance as well. And once there will be some successes in the counteroffensive in the eastern part of and southern part of Ukraine, then maybe there will be a room for diplomacy, but not at this very moment.
People keep waving and want to ask questions, and I want you to too, because it's a great opportunity. We do have some folks with mics, so why don't we start with that? How about you, sir? Yeah.
Well, good morning, and I'm very glad to be here. We're off-white from the Defense Security Corporation University. This question is directed to the active congressperson. A few years ago, Governor George Bush, in debate with Senator one of the senators had made the comment, American foreign policy is consistently inconsistent. I bring that up because we're facing
inconsistent.
We're facing midterms. What's going to happen?
Okay.
Well, get out my crystal ball. Look, I generally, and I'm a Democratic member of Congress, but I can read the polls and I understand math. I think it is highly likely that Republicans will win will take over the House of Representatives. The Senate is a bit more uncertain, in part because there are so few competitive seats. Really only 4 that I would characterize as highly competitive, Pennsylvania, my own state, being one of them. Now, the question then, let me link it to kind of the point of why we're here, the Security Forum. How would foreign policy change then if we go back to, by the way, what has been the post-World War II norm, and that is split government? If we go back to that, if Republicans at least take over the House, regardless whether they take over the Senate, we would again have divided government. I hope and I believe that support for Ukraine, support for NATO, support for internationalism would continue. But I will say that presumably Speaker Kevin McCarthy would have a real challenge on his hand within his conference. And if he has a good third or so of his Republican conference voting against legislation that he's putting up, we can't take for granted that that will happen, and that's the political reality.
Thank you so much. That gentleman right there, yeah, in the black t-shirt.
Sorry, good morning. I'm Patrick Wilson from MediaTek. My question is a response to something we heard yesterday, and I'm anxious to hear the panel's reply. Obviously, Putin has nostalgia for a Soviet empire, and he said it out loud. And some critics of those of us in the room might say we have some nostalgia about the Cold War ourselves, right, about the NATO alliance and its successes. But yesterday, I noted that the representative of the Chinese government that was here made a very strong case that they're not the Soviet Union, they're not the USSR, and it's not the Cold War. I wondered what our Cold War experts think of that argument.
Ambassador Hutchison, you want to take a stab?
Well, I thought the Chinese ambassador was very, very clear, very creative with the facts, and hand him that. But there really is a difference, I believe, in the Cold War with Russia and what we are looking at with China. Because the Chinese depend so much on the Western countries as part of the trade that they have dominated so well. And they're going to be looking at our alliance, which is why I think our unity is so important, because we can't hurt Russia very much other than energy, which we're working on, and we're going to be weaning off Russia. But China depends on all of this trade with the West. and they're going to look very carefully at being aggressive and pushing us away. So our Cold War with China is going to be to continue to manage our unity in trade negotiations that will deter the conflict with China.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you had a question as well.
Thank you. Anne Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America. It's great to see my old friend Ivo on the panel, and I respect his judgment enormously, but I'm going to challenge it.
It's a very Anne Marie Slaughter moment.
So I have a question, Ivo, for you and for the Deputy Foreign Minister. You said, you know, NATO is pulled together, and, you know, we are reminding the Europeans and doing everything we can so that they know we're there for them. My reading of the German spending of 2%, the commitment to 2%, was a little different. The Chancellor Scholz made pretty clear that it was quite possible in 2024 that somebody else would be elected and they couldn't count on us. And when I'm in Europe, that's what I hear more than anything, which is your politics are a mess, and we had 4 years of lack of commitment to NATO, and that could come again, and we're more on our own in terms of defending ourselves.
So I don't think the two are inconsistent. I think clearly the statement that Chancellor Scholz made on the 27th of February, remarkable statement. If you haven't read it, do read it. Made a commitment that said, as the minister said, we've woken up to the reality that war is now part of our new way of thinking in Europe. As a result, we're going to enshrine 2% in the Constitution, which means that if there is a change of government in Germany, 2% will be spent, and we're going to invest 100 billion euros in procurement of activities to build up our own capabilities. The United States, since the 1950s, in fact, since Harry S. Truman, has asked the Europeans to do more for their defense. And that's been a consistent pattern of all administrations and of all ambassadors. We have, big welts on our heads banging the table for Europeans to spend more, and finally they are. Now, if the extra incentive to do more also means because they think they may not be able to rely on the United States, so much the better. I have no problem with that. By the way, I have no problem with Europe doing more. I think the manner in which it is done, whether it's through the European Union and NATO, I know that this is not one a NATO ambassador is supposed to talk about. I don't have a problem in any of this. I just want to have a very strong Europe. And how we get there is by encouraging them to do. I think it's easier to get the Europeans to do more if we're there than if we're not there. By the way, in part because of the efforts, the valiant, heroic efforts of Ambassador Hutchison, whatever Donald Trump said, we're still in NATO. And we are strongly in NATO. We were able to be there in NATO. And that is important. Institutions matter. Congressman Boyle and all of his colleagues repeatedly mentioned and told and voted.
And bipartisan delegations.
In bipartisan ways, but voted to say, you cannot withdraw from NATO without our consent. So I have a lot of confidence in the American ability to continue to be able to be involved in Europe. Our politics, that's for another day. That's for another session. It may be a mess. But we have gone through a very significant time frame, and we've come out with a NATO that is stronger, more capable, in part because we have a lot of people in this country at the official level and the non-official level that believe that being in NATO is important. So I feel confident that whatever happens in 2024, God forbid, NATO at least, will still be there.
Could I jump in 1 second and say I agree totally with everything you've said, but I do want to point out that Chancellor Scholz is a social democrat, not the Christian Democrat that Merkel was. So he has taken this on. And secondly, the Greens are pro-NATO as well. So the coalitions in Germany, I have more confidence in because it was the publics that stood up even before Chancellor Scholz and said, we should be helping Ukraine. So thank you for that, but I think we're in a very good position.
Mr. Minister?
Yep. With regard to Germany, it wouldn't be a surprise that among friends, allies, and partners, there are somehow frank discussions, and there was a bit of criticism from our side to Germany with regard to their relations with Russia, with regard to their energy policy and the security policy. So we welcome, of course, this change, but we would rather see as a first step the change in the energy policy and the relations with Russia, cut all those political and business links with Russia, further isolation of Russia, change the energy policy for, more friendly environment, green technologies, and gas supplies, just like us, maybe from the US or other partners, not from Mr. Putin, because it was because of those business links for the last 20 years that Mr. Putin thought that he is strong enough to do what he started in February. And having said that, I think that the German Chancellor has even more responsibility as the biggest economy of the European Union to do even more with regard to Ukraine and offering their assistance, not less, more than every other country in the European Union. So let's be ambitious. Let's encourage our German partners to a bit more actively, not starting only with the security policy, but also other sectors.
I want to call on everyone here, including Congressman Harman, but they're absolutely making me stop the panel because we're way over. But obviously, this was just an extraordinary opportunity for all of us with very wonderful and committed public servants. So please help me thank them.